This is The First Century, a podcast devoted to stories from that influential period of history including Rome, Judea, Christianity, and more. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Schmisek. Get ready to go back in time and enter a world before computers, the stagecoach, the printing press, or even stirrups had been invented for horses. We're about to enter the first century. Episode 10. Pontius Pilate arrives in Judea as prefect. In 26 CE, a new prefect arrived in Judea, Pontius Pilate, and he made his headquarters in Caesarea Maritima. An equestrian, Pilate was ready to be prefect in this difficult environment, even if the legate of Syria, Lamia, was still in Rome, where he had been for the past 4 years since he'd been appointed to that post. The title prefect, or in Greek, eparchos, indicated that the province was in the early stages of pacification. Prefect meant a limited staff of messengers and scribes, as well as auxiliary units, typically consisting of 5 infantry cohorts and 1 cavalry regiment. A prefect would have had full military and judicial authority. The fact that Pilate's supervisor, Lucius Aelius Lamia, the legate of Syria, was not physically present but was in Rome made a challenging situation even more so. There would be no governor with extra troops ready to come to his aid if things became problematic. Pilate knew that with the province in the earliest stages of Roman rule, he would need to squelch any riots before they grew, or even better, before they even started. One of the first meetings Pilate took was with Caiaphas the high priest, who had been in the role many years. Day-to-day administration was often left to the high priest. The prefect could appoint or depose the high priest at will, and the vestments of the high priest, essential for religious ceremonies, were kept by Romans under their own custody. The previous Roman prefect, Gratus, had served 11 years, and during that time made multiple changes in the appointment of high priests. Gratus deposed Ananus and replaced him with Ishmael ben Fabus, who did not last long before he was replaced by Eleazar, then Simon, and finally Caiaphas, son-in-law of Ananus. Though Pilate as prefect could replace Caiaphas as high priest, the two got off to a good start, and Pilate determined that Caiaphas would work with him. They worked so well together and formed such a mutually beneficial relationship that they served together for Pilate's entire 10 years, from 26 to 36 CE. The province had 2 effective capitals. Jerusalem, with its temple, was the religious center, whereas Caesarea Maritima, built by Herod the Great on the Mediterranean coast, was the Roman administrative center. Pilate established his headquarters in Caesarea Maritima and therefore had easy access to communication from Rome. Lengthy though the journey was, news from Rome could reach Caesarea at least a day or so earlier than it would in Jerusalem. Caesarea Maritima was a beautiful seaside city with a new harbor and an aqueduct bringing fresh spring water from more than 10 miles away to the coastal town. Pilate spent much of his time here, owing partly to the natural beauty of the place, as well as the more standard Roman amenities, especially compared to Jerusalem with the temple and its vortex of religious fervor. Shortly after Pilate arrived, in a display of Roman pride and the power of occupation, he ordered the Roman standards to be placed in Jerusalem under cover of the night. Roman standards were effectively long poles with insignia and symbols placed on top, including animals, words, or images of the emperor. Because these standards appeared overnight and depicted images of the emperor, they were considered antithetical to Mosaic law, which prohibited such images. The populace rose up in indignity and went to Caesarea Maritima to confront Pilate directly. Those motivated by religious conviction, offended by Pilate's placing the Roman standards in the city of Jerusalem, made their way to Caesarea Maritima and positioned themselves prostrate around Pilate's house, imploring him to remove the standards. Pilate decided to simply wait them out. But after 5 days, his patience had worn thin, so he developed a devious plan. He called them to the stadium and took his seat at the tribunal, the official place from which Roman announcements and judgments were delivered. As he began speaking, he flashed a prearranged signal to the Roman legionaries, who immediately surrounded the supplicants with a ring of soldiers 3 persons deep. Pilate shouted that he would have the legionaries cut them all down if they did not acquiesce to the standards. Pilate had them just where he wanted them. He imagined that they would scurry back to Jerusalem with their collective tail between their legs. The soldiers themselves were ready to deliver Roman pacification and had longed for this opportunity to show the subjects what occupation really meant. But the religious fervor among the crowd would not break. Its hold was tight, just as the people liked it. They were standing not merely on principle, but on God's law, the very law handed down on Mount Sinai to Moses more than 1,000 years earlier, before there even was a Rome. The supplicants threw themselves down prostrate again, as they once were in front of Pilate's palace, but now in the stadium. They implored Pilate that they would rather die than transgress God's law. They even adjusted their cloaks and tunics to reveal their necks, and said that the soldiers should strike them down if Pilate insisted on keeping the standards in Jerusalem. This action on their part made Pilate reconsider. How would it appear if he killed these people during his first few months as prefect? They would likely protest, send an embassy to Tiberius, and Pilate imagined there was at least a 50-50 chance he would be removed. An equestrian, he wanted to demonstrate that he could indeed pacify this unruly province. Surely there was another way. So he told them to go home and that he would have the standards removed. This did not end the way he anticipated, but it was better for him to have avoided a catastrophe and thus remain in power. He was sure he would have another chance to mete out Roman justice. The fervor of the people and their devotion to their law was something he had not seen before. It would require a different strategy and a strong ally in the high priest. Not long afterwards, Pilate was conferring with Caiaphas about the dwindling supply of water in Jerusalem. He thought it best to construct an aqueduct to tap a source of water more than 25 miles away. If the people experienced the good that came from Roman rule, pacification would be easier. Plus, there were more than adequate funds in the temple treasury, which Pilate directed to fund the project. Caiaphas warned that this funding source would cause trouble with the people, but he also pledged to support Pilate if that were to occur. True to form, when the people heard that the money dedicated to the temple went instead to build an aqueduct, they were incensed. The next time Pilate visited Jerusalem, those who were enraged by this use of funds began a protest. They formed a ring around the tribunal of Pilate, shouting, raising their fists, and generally conducting themselves as an angry mob. Having been warned that this could happen, and having experienced the crowd's hostilities not long ago with the standards incident, Pilate was ready. He would not threaten to kill them like he did earlier when they protested the standards. He remembered in Caesarea how they offered their necks and would willingly become martyrs for the cause. But this time, he considered, a beating would be more convenient, and it would have a similar effect. So earlier in the day, he outfitted some of the troops with civilian clothes and cudgels. He told them to mingle with the crowd, and that if things grew unruly, he would give them a signal, at which time they were to beat the rioters mercilessly. Now, with his own tribunal surrounded, the angry mob growing more violent, calling him names and insulting Rome itself, Pilate gave the signal. The civilian-clothed troops were only too eager to receive it. They reached for their clubs and cudgels and enthusiastically beat the crowd without pity. Driven by fear, the masses trampled many of those who were not clubbed to death by the soldiers. Pilate had learned a fine lesson. A good beating would disperse the crowd. Back in Rome, Sejanus's power was centralized, confirmed, and reaching a peak in 27 CE when the Senate voted to make his birthday a holiday. It was a bright spot in an otherwise challenging year, for there was a fire in Rome that destroyed the Caelian Hill, and a temporary amphitheater in Fidenae collapsed, injuring and even killing many of the 50,000 spectators. Though Tiberius did not come to Rome, he did venture from Capri to Fidenae to assist the survivors in what was the worst stadium disaster in Roman history. It was determined that the temporary amphitheater was not constructed properly. So the Roman Senate responded by ensuring that only people with at least 400,000 sesterces could host games, and that in the future all amphitheaters had to be built on a solid foundation and then inspected by authorities before being used by the public. In 28, the 13-year-old Agrippina the Younger, daughter of the deceased Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, was married to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, who was almost 20 years her senior. On paper, it was a good match, as Domitius, as he was known, had already served as consul, and his family had a distinguished history. He was the son of Antonia the Elder, who was herself the daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia the Younger. His two sisters were Domitia and Domitia Lepida. His father was a fine Roman general, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, and was instrumental in subduing Germania, and had also accompanied young Gaius to Syria, along with Quirinius and Sejanus. And Agrippina's new husband was rich, but he also had a terrible temper, punctuated with a mean streak. He was said to be, quote, hateful in every walk of life, end quote. There are many stories of his cruelty, including him ripping the eye out of an equestrian at the Forum because Domitius believed that he was behaving rudely towards him. Domitius, while riding in his chariot, also once ran over a child on purpose. There are stories of Domitius cheating people, including prize winners when he sponsored races, and he even murdered a freedman who would not drink as much as him during a party. In response to that particular episode, Domitius was no longer invited to imperial parties, but that did little to change his behavior. The teenage Agrippina was married to this older, cruel man. In 28, Claudius also remarried, this time to Aelia Paetina. Together they had a child, Claudia Antonia, but the marriage did not last, and he divorced Aelia in October of 31. Eventually in 29 CE, with Tiberius remaining in Capri, Sejanus began a series of treason trials, charges that were once understood as treason, that is, serious violations against Rome or the people, were now expanded to include even an insult or a bad word said against the emperor. The treason laws allowed any citizen to make an accusation, and for Sejanus, an accusation was as good as proof, and treason meant execution. Sejanus would draw up a list of victims, and Tiberius would approve the list from Capri. Those executed had their property seized, which became part of the imperial coffers.